All right, now if the AV guy quits messing with me, are we recording? Awesome. All right, yay! Thanks for the one guy who applauded in the room for getting the AV fixed. So again, now that we have AV going, my name is Matt Shear. You may follow me on Twitter at C3RKAH or on LinkedIn, and also the slide deck is available, so check it out if you want. Today's talk is called Lend Me Your IRs. So I'm going to have to kind of go in fast mode here since we lost some time. But I'm a senior system security engineer at First Financial Bank in Cincinnati, Ohio. I run the SIMPA Security SIG. If you're ever around Cincinnati, third Thursday of any month, we meet and have awesome sort of B-sides quality meetings. And I'm also a Bug Crowd ambassador and security researcher. So today's objectives are we're going to show live demo reenactments of real attacks. And it's going to be on how these real-world attacks worked, how and why they defeated security solutions, and then we're going to show instant responses to these attacks, demoing the investigation tools and techniques, as well as discuss lessons learned and key takeaways. So we're all on the same page. To start it off with, the acronyms I'm going to use and throw about here are IOC, which is Indicator of Compromise, IR, which is Incident Response, and DFIR, which is Digital Forensics and Incident Response. So you may hear these bantied about throughout today's talk. So some quick disclaimers here, that the demos are all based on 100% true stories. They dutifully recreate actual attacks. However, I've altered a lot of the details. So the investigation demos are sped up considerably in the interest of time. And also, when you do these techniques, only do so on a dedicated, securely isolated, and volatile sandbox. And if you're like me, if you have a commercial sandbox, use that. If you don't have that, then use something like SIFT or Remnux, or build out your own. Whatever you want to do there. I'm just here to give you an informative InfoSec talk. I'm not your parent, and I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. So with that, let's go ahead and kick it off. I don't know how many speakers here at HackerCon are doing live demos. However, I am one doing them, and it's either because I'm bold, fearless, or crazy. Please pick two, so I'm not just crazy. All right, so my first scenario is called the mystery attachment. And so, going back to a news headline, on August 17th of 2018, mouse spam campaigns target banks using Microsoft Publisher. The flawed Amy rat was part of the Nakurs botnet, as reported by researchers at TrustWave. And if you get the slide deck, here's the link to the article down at the bottom. Got re-reported in numerous places, but best I could tell, they were the ones who put it out first. So to set the table, one day I'm diligently working at my desk, probably on like half a dozen things at one time, and all of a sudden, in the midst of my working on whatever I was working on, have a important person running up to my desk and say, "Matt, help, one of our VIPs with access to lots of sensitive information just got hit in that recent mouse spam campaign targeting banks. It matches IOCs from reports of that new flawed Amy rat, which is part of the Nakurs botnet. The recipient attempted to open the MS Publisher attachment on their smartphone. I need you to drop whatever you are doing and investigate this. We'll get the attachment to you as soon as possible." Now, I am not a mobile forensics expert. We don't necessarily maybe have great tools for that, but I'm the closest person we have and that can look at it. So, all right, we'll take a look, see what we can figure out here. So I get the attachment, and we'll go ahead and open it. Now, when I'm demoing stuff here, we have to pretend that I'm using a sandbox. These are live demos. I've built a custom environment here, and in the interest of time, I don't have time to fire up a proper sandbox. So when you see me doing this stuff in the talk, just imagine, if you will, that I'm doing this in a sandbox, like in real life. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up here, and let me see if I can get the optimal width so it's not such an eye chart. So open up this publisher file in the sandbox, and I see this text that the macros basically have to be enabled to display the contents. Click the Enable Content button. What was really interesting is I couldn't actually get that to pop up and execute the macro. I couldn't even get the prompt to make it happen. And I thought, well, this is odd because clearly that's how this thing would appear to be staged. I've seen this type of thing before. Chances are a lot of people in this room have seen this kind of thing before. So anyway, I'm detonating it in the sandbox to get the analysis on it. And when I get the detailed analysis report on it, it didn't really necessarily look particularly bad. Couldn't really find any signs of here's something malicious. So I'm thinking, well, that's definitely odd. But let's try to understand, sort of what's happening with it. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back into my folder. And I will maximize this and blow it up so everybody can see it better. So there's my publisher file. Hopefully folks can see that okay. I can maybe expand it just a little bit more. So what I want to do is run through strings, just this, oops, helps if I tab complete that. So what I want to do is run this thing through strings. Oops. Oh, you know what? I'm going to pipe it out to less. Now I could basically direct this output to a text file and open up in an editor of my choosing. If I don't redirect it to a file, I can basically pipe it out to less and just kind of scroll through it here and see if there's anything that stands out. Maybe some sort of an artifact left in there in plain text, or maybe some sort of a character string I can basically search on to figure out who's done this. I really didn't find anything crazy in here. Nothing told me like, hey, this is necessarily awful. So go ahead and quit out of there. Clear that up. So as I'm looking at that, I'm thinking, well, let's go ahead and get a hash of this file, since I'm not understanding at this point exactly what it's doing. So I'm going to go ahead and, so I type in the right command. SHA-256 sum and the file name, and here I have the hash for the file. So anybody who sees that, think, all right, let's go ahead and do some searching on this. Clicked the wrong thing there. So I know that you're not going to be able to see the URL, but there's the hash value, the same one we were just looking at. This is virus total, which has about 70 some odd AV scanners. Nothing has seen this particular file, which I found interesting because usually that's the kind of attachment that will get repurposed. It could be, customized, a new variant of it, something like that. But I really thought, had a good chance of finding a result. So here you can see a little better with Gesundheit. Here you can see a little better with the hash value, but you can also see nothing again was found. So the question is, what else? Let's take a look on hybrid analysis. A lot of people submit to there to see if they can find stuff. Again, no results found. And you can see, you can't see it real well, but basically the hash value and the URL up above. It says last resort. Let's just search for it on Google. And again, absolutely no results. So at this point, I'm not really sure what I have. I can't really understand what it's doing. It's basically defeating every security scanner app that I'm throwing at it. And I found nothing in strings. Never seen the hash anywhere. And I'm really contemplating, what's my next step now on this mobile device? And I'm just thinking, well, do we say, well, chances a publisher file is going to do something super malicious on an iPhone, for example, is unlikely, and think it's an acceptable risk. It seems like a really bad idea, so I kind of instantly set that one aside. And then I think, well, what if we did a security wipe on a mobile device and then gave it back to the user? Would that be adequate enough to safely say risk is pretty low, that something happened here? But again, thinking who this is and the type of information they could have, it doesn't seem like a good idea. Now, they weren't ready for a refresh quite yet, but they were pretty close to it. So I'm thinking, well, perhaps what we want to do here is actually commandeer the device, shut it down, throw it in the forensics lab, and essentially order them an updated model and go ahead and replenish that user with a new device anyway. As I'm thinking through all these thoughts in my head, I thought, well, this is kind of lame, but I didn't actually look at the EXIF data. And in Windows, it's pretty simple. You right-click on the file, you go into the properties, and you look on the details tab, and you look for things like author or other hints. You always have to take that stuff with a grain of salt, but it's pretty easy to do. In Linux, if I use the Perl EXIF tool, I can take a look at that. So let me go ahead and pull up the file here. And as I'm looking at it, all of these things that seem like a little weird on the file type and the extension and the MIME type, all that matches Microsoft Publisher to a T. So it's definitely a genuine publisher file, no doubt about that. Now the author didn't say test fish, but I will give you an idea what it did actually show me. Let me go ahead and pull up the next slide. What it was a facepalm moment, because it was our test phishing vendor was the author. Now, I spent hours looking into this, trying to understand what it did. Online research, I mean, you name it. I was looking at details around, the bad Amy flaw, looking for IOCs that I could, sort of look at what traits, characteristics. I was contemplating doing some memory forensics on it, even though it's not my bread and butter. I dabbled in it a little bit. So I spent all that time, but not taking that as a grain of salt, because obviously the EXIF data could be spoofed. I went to the mail server and I looked at the headers, and sure enough, it came from the mail server at our phishing vendor, test phishing vendor. What I saw for the IP address is, yes, Matt, this really is your test phishing vendor's IP address. You dolt. So it's okay, you can laugh at my pain. But let's talk about what went wrong. So what went wrong is I got caught up in the moment, subconsciously letting somebody else influence my investigation. Their anxiety and their bad assumptions honestly wore off on me. They were like super amped up about it, and it got me worked up as a result. And they were talking about the attachment, and I got so honed in and focused on the attachment that really I lost sight of my own processes and procedures, which namely, and I've given a lot of phishing forensics talks, a lot of different conferences, was, always start with the email headers. And so I abandoned it this one time, and I lost focus on what I was doing. So the road to redemption here was painful lessons learned for reminders to stick to my standard investigative processes and procedures. If I would have started by looking at the headers first, instead of getting buried into the attachment, I could have closed out this investigation in minutes instead of hours. But since it was a false alarm, in a sense, there are no further technical actions required on this one. So scenario 2 is security scanner evasion. So what happened in the environment is identical phishing emails started hitting inboxes, and wild-scaled reports of phishing came pouring in. The phishing page link no longer appeared to be working in my security scanner. Was the malicious site taken offline already? Let's investigate and find out. So the investigation will start by looking at the message source and looking for hyperlinks. Then we're going to look at the demo page with or the landing page rather, with a security scanner solution, or a pretend one in this case. And then we're going to look at the source code and open the phishing page in our sandbox. So let's go ahead and do those things. So let me go ahead and pull up the phishing email here. And I will blow this up so everybody can see it here. Now there are parts of this you won't be able to see in the room in the headers, unfortunately. But it's from evil.scammer@promisewearelegit.com. The subject is, this link is totally safe, and it's to phishing target, which is unwittingvictim@randomtarget.org. And the email, as you see, says, hello, phishing target. We have a really important message for you. To retrieve your message, click here. Real subtle, right? Regards, spoof sender. Now, in spite of the fact that there were more red flags in this message than he could find inside of Vladimir Putin's garage, as souvenirs from his old KGB days, you know if I sent this out as a test phishing campaign, there's probably at least that one person in everybody's organization that's still going to click on that link, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at the source code here. In Thunderbird, we would do that under View and Message Source. Make that a little bit bigger. Oops. All right, so here's our URL from the phishing email. So what happens when we look at that inside of a security scanner? Let me go ahead and pull this up. So I pull it in, get a screenshot of it. 404 error. Like we've all seen this, right? It's when a resource is taken offline, it's not available, something's happened to the server, you name it. Essentially, this 404 message is, hey, it's already gone. So nothing to worry about, right? We just close this case and move on, or at least, we could do that, but we might want to dig just a little bit deeper. So clear that up. And so what we want to do is go ahead and see if we can grab this information. So we'll go ahead and do curl, and I've still got the website address copied in here. Then we'll do output, and we'll call it unknown.html. That's one way to retrieve it. We could also use wget. So let me go ahead and do wget and paste in the URL. Now, if we look at these, we'll notice that they're the same file size. If I basically do a SHA-256 sum, both of these files have the same SHA-256 hash value. So forensically, it doesn't really matter a whole lot which we're using. Now, some of you might say, well, the timestamp's different. We got one from today's date. That's only because of the demo environment. In real life, it's going to show you whatever the, if you use wget, it's going to show you the time that you retrieved it. Since it's just grabbing a local copy in this case, it doesn't actually change that. So in real life, you wouldn't have that benefit of seeing the original date. But you can tell from the hash value, the file size, these are basically the same file. So it doesn't really matter which method you use in this case. They both work the same for our purposes. So let's go ahead and pull up the index.html file to see what was going on with it. So I'll blow this up here a little bit, and I've made this as easy to understand as possible. But basically, what's going on is we're doing some user agent checks in the source code here, and it's looking for things like Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Opera, and Safari. And if it matches one of those user agent strings, it sends it to a different page. If it is not matching one of those, it sends it traffic to a 404 error page. I thought that was pretty clever because that actually did fool at least one security scanner that I threw at it. It wasn't until I actually opened up the website address in a new browser that it came through. So we'll go ahead and do that and see what that looks like. And so in the sandbox, when I pull it up, what we essentially have is an Office 365 credential harvesting site. So the site's still live in spite of the first impression that looks like, hey, this thing was actually taken down. So by digging a little bit deeper, we can see what happened. So let's go ahead and talk about it a little more. Just some observations I had from that. So we talked about the user agent string-based redirection. I got lucky in this case. They used JavaScript, because if they had used a server-side language like PHP or Python or any number of them, that's not even a full representative list, but some of the popular ones, I wouldn't have seen it, because you need, essentially privileged server access to actually see that on the server side. If it's not your server that was compromised, probably not going to get that, at least not legally. And most places aren't just going to let you hop on their server and take a ride to see, hey, can I see what your hacked web server code look like? Probably not going to be too supportive unless you happen to work like law enforcement, maybe. Something I thought about is, this technique could actually be used by threat actors. Let's say they had an exploit kit that only worked on Firefox as an arbitrary example. What they could do is they could actually check to see if visitors have the Firefox browser. If they do, direct them to the exploit payload page, and then round robin redirect them back to the real page. Those browser redirects happen so fast, most users aren't even going to notice. Probably wouldn't even see it. It's going to happen so fast. And then meanwhile, it would direct everything else to the actual page. It's going to make it really hard to detect, because unless your security tools are sending user agent strings of Firefox, in our example, it's not necessarily going to hit that. And you could get very detailed with that. You could even look for specific vulnerable versions and do the same thing. So threat actors could really sort of take that to the next level. And in terms of the first one, server-side languages, I think I've actually seen that one in the wild just a month ago, where one browser took me to one page and another browser took me to a different page. And I couldn't tell from the source code what was happening. So I suspect that they actually were using that first technique that I was talking about there. So our remediation plan for this was we determined where the actual phishing landing page was at, and we blocked it through web content filtering. And then this wide-scale phishing campaign, we worked with our secure email gateway vendor to block the active phishing campaign. The last scenario I'm going to talk about is I call it the rabbit hole. And so to preface this one, I received a request from a user to investigate an email message they received to determine if it's legitimate or not. The email certainly looked like it could be fishy at first glance, but is it just suspicious or is it malicious? And I gave a talk by this title. My favorite version is B-Sides Cleveland. If you search YouTube on B-Sides Cleveland, is it just suspicious or is it malicious? You can find that talk if you're interested in seeing it. So, the investigation side, I could tell, and we'll take a look at this in a minute, but from the message headers, the source IP was a mismatch. But the message source code was particularly interesting. I noticed that the hyperlink didn't actually go to where the link text said it did. We'll look at that here in just a second. And then the malicious threat actor's objective appeared to be a credential harvesting site for the purposes of account takeover. So let's look at this stuff. Let me go ahead and open up our phishing email here. And it's from PayPal support, ppsupport@pwn-server.org. And the subject is PayPal bank account change confirmation. And against to our unwitting victim phishing target. It's, dear PayPal customer, your request to update your bank account on file will complete in the next 4 hours. If you didn't request this change, log into your PayPal account to reject the pending activity. Now, if you have a PayPal account and you're an unsuspecting user, you think, wait a minute, this is crazy, man. I didn't initiate a bank account change. I need to log in and refute this or reject the change because I've only got 4-hour window to do it, right? That sense of urgency, that's that lure. And you look at the URL and it's like, yeah, that's a legitimate PayPal login page link. Looks good. But let's go ahead and take a look at the message source on this one as well. Make it a little bigger. So notice the link text actually shows, the PayPal sign-in. But if we look at the actual hyperlink, it's, some .be site, which is in Belgium. And in this case, it's a demo attack destination 1. So we look at that and we think, well, already we've got our first layer of obfuscation because the link text doesn't match the actual hyperlink. Obviously, we're not going to gain anything by copying the legitimate PayPal address, so we'll go ahead and grab the phishing link to understand what's happening here, and to sort of show everybody what that would look like. Oops. Oh, I see what happened. I added href. Sorry, folks, I copied too much. All right, so here we go. So, fake PayPal login page. Looks like the PayPal login page. So people enter their credentials in here and go through that process. Now the threat actors have their PayPal username and password. Anybody think that their next step is going to be to log into PayPal and transfer some funds? Probably a pretty good chance. Or go on a shopping trip for a fake store. Also, maybe use these credentials to find other payment services. Hey, are they using the same password, username and password on Amazon? Probably going to try some, credential stuffing. They've got account credentials for one site, service. Probably go to the others. Yeah. So actually, the address does sort of display. What's interesting is we started off in Belgium. But what we have here, what we're looking at a compromised server in Germany. It's a .de domain. So already we've sort of got another weird obfuscation going on here, where it's not the first page, but we're actually looking at something else. So let's go ahead and curl, and we'll grab that URL here. And we'll output that to a first file. Output, -- output. We'll call it firstpage.html. And we'll go ahead and open this up so everybody can see it inside of an editor. Now this was the URL from the actual phishing email, the actual hyperlink. What's interesting is I log in and look at it here, and it's actually doing an HTTP meta refresh. That's how we got from the request in Belgium. Now it's redirecting to another compromised web host in Germany. So very interesting. And what we want to do to understand is kind of repeat that process and look at the source code at the German page. So we'll go ahead and repeat that process. We'll do another curl. And we'll put in that web URL -- output, and we'll call it second page.html. We have that, so go ahead and do gedit, and we'll do second page, and the ampersand so it's in a detached window. Oops. And we'll blow that up. And what's interesting is it looked like we were on that German page, right? But actually we really weren't, because what it had inside the code was actually an iframe going to another host. So there's another compromised web server, and it's in another different country. Now we're in the Netherlands. Now we're doing a whole European tour on this one phishing email. So we've gone for the first layer of obfuscation of hyperlink text not matching the link text not matching the hyperlink. We've got a meta refresh, and then we've got an iframe. So now we've got another layer of obfuscation. This is really becoming the rabbit hole, which is why I titled the attack that for that reason. So we'll go ahead and get the final destination and see what that looks like. So we'll go ahead and curl. We'll paste that in here again. We'll do a -- output, third page.html. Now, I'm just going to do gedit here because it's easy for me to make that readable. Oops. Paste in that URL we copied from, again, the second country server. Now we're on the third. Oops. need a third page. Third page. Proceed. So, bunch of gobbledygook that we're looking at here. Like, this isn't readable. Like, we're no longer redirecting and iframing and stuff like that. We've got basically what boils down to a mess. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like in real life when we punch in that URL. We'll use Google's built-in developer tools to help us out, which are really great. Someday I'd love to do just a talk on using built-in browser developer tools for forensics. So we'll take a look at the HTML and let's see if I can make this a little better. So it's not great. What we're kind of looking at here, so we've got a document write and an unescape, and we got a big sequence here. And then that's followed by this df and another big sequence. Now I've intentionally put white space in to make this more readable. And I know looking at it, some of you are thinking, that's readable? Well, it kind of isn't, but just to kind of break it down a little bit what we're looking at here. So we've got the document write and the unescape sequence. What we can guess is that this is creating the sequence and it's feeding in a function into it, this sequence here, to basically produce the output. Now in the olden days, you used to have to unescape this to basically understand the formula that makes the rest of the stuff work. Fortunately now the browser developer tools are so good, the best important thing to remember is that if it's renderable in a browser, it has to be something that can be decoded. The good news is we don't have to necessarily do all that stuff by hand anymore. We can actually scroll down past all the encoded stuff. And now we can actually see, using the browser developer tools, what was in there. And so here's the formula. It's nice and decoded for us. We can actually see the HTML code that makes that work. Something that's more interesting, you're like, well, I thought you decoded it. There's more gobbledygook. Actually, what this is there's base64 encoding inside of this JavaScript encoded page. So now we have encoded elements inside of an encoded page. So this is getting really deep. We'll talk about this stuff here in a moment. We'll keep kind of looking at it. And all of a sudden, we've got another base64 encoded item. And we can guess based on the MIME type here that it's an image file that's base64 encoded. And just kind of looking at it, we'll go ahead and take a look at the sources. The good thing is that with, the network tab, and we'll look at the image. Let me go ahead and reload that page real quick here. Come back in. Let's see here. You know what? I think it's because, hold on, let me get that link out of here and paste it back in. It's not actually rendering it there because that's that iframe that we were looking at. Yeah, just relaunch a new Google window here just to make sure. Fire up developer tools again. We'll come back, paste in again. This is the actual final landing page that we found through our forensic trail. All right, so now here we find within the headers we can look at the data image, and here's that base64 image. And the nice thing is we hit the preview tab up the top and it actually shows us what the image file is. It decodes it for us automatically, which is fantastic. That's just saving us work right there. But you'll notice it only finds one image. There are actually two base64 encoded elements inside of this. So let's go back and take a quick look at that and just kind of show you, if we do this stuff by hand, what that looks like. So our first item didn't show up in that list, which is basically this long base64 encoded string. So what I want to do is go ahead and just copy this out. I don't know if it'll let me. Here we go. Get to the bottom. And let me back off. So I'm grabbing the stuff inside the quotes here. Oops, missing the last two. There we go. All right, we open up new gedit and just create a new tab. Paste all this stuff in here. And we'll go ahead and save it to our DFIR folder. And we'll just call it unknown.ico. Save it out. And so what I'm thinking, again, based on the MIME type here, and what we're seeing is, you can see in here, shortcut icon, data for the MIME type, data, image, X icon, base 64. So I'm guessing this is an icon file. So let's go ahead and, now that we have it, oops. Here's our file, but we can't just look at it as it is, so we have to decode that. So we'll go ahead and base 64-D, and it's unknown.ico, and we'll basically redirect that output to favicon.ico. Oh, I did? Yeah, there we go. Thank you for that. That's a typo. Thanks for good catch. All right, so let's see what that looks like. So I'm just going to launch Chrome, and we'll call up the favicon ICO file, and there it is. Sure enough, if we go back to the compromised website, oops, that was on the first tab. You can see, I know it's really tiny, but up here in the top, you maybe can't see it real well, but yeah, sure enough, it's our fav icon for the page. So that's how we would sort of go back and do that stuff by hand. Go ahead and pull this back up. Oops. So the first destination, we talked about it, went to a page in one foreign country. The second page was in yet another foreign country, and then the landing page went to a compromised web host in another foreign country. We got the source code on that stuff. The malicious threat actors used JavaScript encoding to avoid analysis and detection while hiding the page source, and we certainly saw that in action. So we decoded the source page using built-in browser developer tools. And so the encoded elements, whether the threat actors use encoded elements to avoid analysis and detection or keep the entire site as a single page file, they use base64 encoded elements within their JavaScript encoded page. So by decoding the elements using the developer tools, we could see what the image files, or at least the one was, and then looked at doing that by hand. A remediation plan in this instance, we determined the final landing page, again, is that third compromised server in the foreign country, and that was the first thing I blocked. Then went back through and got the intermediary one, so we blocked the other two as well. And then I reported the web compromises through the Whois contacts. I don't think I heard back from any of them, but I made at least the effort on my part, and they were blocked for our users. So with that, that's really the demos and the scenarios I had for you today. But as you see me wandering around HackerCon, and I'll be here all weekend, please stop by, talk to me, share your own digital forensic incident response stories. With that, friends, Romans, HackerCon attendees, lend me your IRs. So with that, we'll go ahead and open up for questions. Anybody have anything? All right, going once, going twice. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Good. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. Hopefully I can keep y'all awake after lunch here. Edmund and I are both part of Cisco's Talos research team. We pretty much analyze different malware, different ways people are trying to...
You have to talk a little loud.
Okay.
Your audio is not going to have very good
Okay, so I'm going to try and hold this up, and we're going to have a challenge here because there's two of us. So I'm trying to talk into this mic for y'all to hear and into here so the recording can hear. So it'll be an interesting experiment. Anyways, like I said, we both we basically look at malware, ways attackers are trying to target networks, so we can feed that information into our security products to help protect our customers. But today what we're going to do is basically be talking about some of the attacks we've seen over the last couple of years where the attackers are now starting to utilize and manipulate DNS as a way to send data, target networks, even do man-in-the-middle attacks, because as everyone knows, you can't get around without DNS. So that's one of the things we're going to show you just so you can get an idea of some of the things the attackers are doing in the DNS space. So a little bit about myself. I've been doing this forever, before the internet was popular and all this stuff. I've been in over 20 years. I've worked for the Information Warfare Center, done all kinds of things. I wrote security books. I've got security patents, just lots of things in the security space. So got lots of experience on finding ways to attack networks, try to break devices. And now I'm actually working on breaking malware, figuring out how the attackers are trying to slip past our defenses. You know, I can't resist putting pictures of my nice dogs there. Notice at home I have a deterrent. They're very large dogs. It will scare most people away from the house, even though they'll just lick you to death. But hey, it works from a visibility perspective. So I'll turn that over to Edmund and let you introduce him.
Yeah, so we're going to be playing a little mic hot potato here. We'll see how this goes. So my name is Edmund Brumaghin. I'm a security researcher with Cisco Talos as well. I work with Earl. A couple things about me. So I love malware. So this is what we do. Where most individuals and organizations go out of their way to try to avoid getting malware infections within their environment. I'm constantly spending my days detonating malware and hoping that it infects the controlled environments that I'm looking at, so that we can rip it apart, figure out how it works, figure out how it operates, to develop protection that we can push out to all of our customers. So I've been with Talos for a little over 3 years, about 3.5 years, but prior to that I spent the previous decade doing digital forensics, incident response across a variety of different critical infrastructure sectors. So I've worked in nuclear power, fossil fuels power generation, financial services, high tech. So I've seen a lot of the problems that organizations face from a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of different constraints. Also, I'm an avid music fan, so I'm a musician. I play a lot of stringed instruments. It's just a little bit about myself, but really what we're going to cover today is DNS and how adversaries are making use of DNS for various components within the attacks that they're launching against organizations around the world. So we're going to start out with a little bit of a crash course on DNS. So, right, I'm not going to spend 30 minutes reading RFC excerpts. We're going to talk about some very specific portions of how DNS works that are relevant to the types of attacks and types of malware that we're seeing in the wild. We're also going to talk about the different techniques that attackers are using, because we're seeing a larger number of adversaries recognizing that as security in organizations gets better, as security programs mature, in a lot of cases, organizations are doing monitoring, content inspection of more traditional network protocols like HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, SMTP. But a lot of the same organizations don't necessarily do the same level of stringent inspection of the contents of DNS queries and the associated responses. As a result, attackers are starting to leverage that more. And then we're going to talk about ways that you can find some of this sort of activity if you're threat hunting in your environment or you're looking at log data. That's not it. Am I good on audio from your perspective?
It's what's hanging down, right? That's the mic. Yeah, that's the mic. Okay, there you go. That's my time.
Okay, awesome. And then we're going to talk about a few ways that you can defend against this sort of DNS abuse in corporate environments. So let's start out by talking about DNS in general and how DNS works, right? We all know when you put in an address in the address bar on your browser, for instance, you're not actually going to that resource directly. There's a whole handshake that takes place behind the scenes that functions very similar to like the phone book, right? It takes the user-readable content that you associate with host names, domain names, website URLs, and it performs the translation to convert that into the IP address that's actually going to get routed to facilitate connectivity to that resource. So that's kind of how most people see DNS. That's the extent of most user interaction with DNS. You put in user-readable information and you get automatically directed to the resource that you're requesting. But there's actually a whole lot of steps that take place to facilitate that name resolution process. And it's interesting because when I talk about DNS attacks to a lot of organizations, one of the first things that most organizations tell me is, yeah, but we don't let our clients directly connect out to DNS servers on the internet. We block that and only allow our internal servers to connect out to external resolvers. And that works just fine for the adversary, right? When you think about the flow of information, you've got a client, an endpoint in your environment that wants to request resources outside your environment. So they go to your local DNS server, which will then forward the request out to other DNS servers upstream, following a hierarchy until it gets to the root server, which knows where the server is that functions as name resolver for a top-level domain, for instance, which can then redirect you to the name server that services the namespace of the domain you're actually interested in going to. So even though your client's not directly connecting out, there's that forwarding process that happens, and then the associated responses follow that chain back down into your environment to the client that actually requested the resource. So even if your clients aren't directly connecting out to external DNS servers, this is an avenue that attackers can use to transfer information or exfiltrate sensitive information. And in a lot of organizations, there's no security controls to really detect or block this sort of activity. So attackers recognize this. As I mentioned, as security controls get more comprehensive and get more effective, attackers realize that sometimes the soft spot is the DNS infrastructure in an organization, so they'll use it to tunnel information out in the form of TXT record queries and responses. They'll use it for command and control to send commands to infected systems to continue operating in environments that they're targeting. They'll also exfiltrate information in the form of A records, in the form of domain names, or the contents of different queries. We've started to see an escalation in these sort of attacks. So tunneling has been around for a while, but we're starting to see attackers actually start to target the core internet infrastructure that's responsible for global DNS to function, because they recognize that if they can compromise the DNS infrastructure itself, they can maliciously manipulate it such that they can direct victims to their infrastructure. So I want to talk about tunneling very briefly. We're probably all familiar with tunneling as a concept, right? It's a way that you can take a protocol and encapsulate it in another protocol to facilitate communications between two systems. You do it all the time when you execute and connect to VPN endpoints. When you establish VPN tunnels, you're tunneling a bunch of different protocols within that VPN. And DNS tunneling works very, very similar. So it's really practically applicable when it comes to things like bypassing captive portals. So we're all pretty familiar with open Wi-Fi, right? You connect to it, your system gets on the Wi-Fi at a coffee shop or something like that. And in order for you to be able to get web communications working, you have to put in your credentials, and then it has to validate it, and then you get redirected. But one thing you'll notice is in that a lot of configurations, while HTTP and HTTPS may be blocked, DNS is fully allowed out to the internet. So there's a lot of projects that you can look on GitHub and in various places that allow you to tunnel HTTP through DNS to bypass the requirements associated with captive portals. So that's a way that it's really practically applicable. If you want to get an idea or an understanding, you can set up a VPS that functions as a DNS server and establish that DNS tunnel, and it'll provide that functionality without you requiring to sign up or give your PII to a third party. So TXT records, these are super interesting, right? TXT records are short for text record. They've been around for a long time. When they were initially established within the DNS protocol, the idea was that you would take an asset, let's say like a gym server, and you'd append a note to it to maybe denote what data center it's in, or what rack it's located in, or who owns it. And you would do that by creating a TXT record for that host name, and you would append whatever data you wanted. So nowadays they're used for a lot more security-related functions. So things like Sender Policy Framework, SPF, DKIM, DMARC. These are all security controls that organizations put in place to defend against brand abuse due to phishing, or to verify the sender of a message to make sure they're actually not spoofing a legitimate email. So they're used for a lot of very, very relevant security functions. But they're used to basically store information that can be associated or associatable to a specific host within a namespace. So we've seen some interesting attacks that leverage TXT records because they can store a lot of information. And I want to start out by talking about a specific example called DNS Messenger, which I did some research into a while back. So this was pretty interesting. It started with a base64 encoded string. So I was ripping apart malware, monitoring the threat landscape one day, and I noticed that somebody had posted an interesting tweet, and inside of it was a base64 encoded string that when you decoded to SourceFire sucks. So if you're not familiar with Cisco, we acquired SourceFire, and we take that sort of thing and we're like, well, okay, well, I guess what's this associated with? So I had to go through a lot of different malware repositories. Keep in mind, I only had a screenshot of base64 in some PowerShell, no other context. So I had to hunt around and try to reconstruct what this was associated with, what malware or what sort of attack is this associated with, how does it function, what's the initial vector, and I was able to reconstruct an entire infection path and identify the malware and how it was being used in. It was a very sophisticated 4-stage fileless malware. And the way that it got into environments is pretty common mouse spam campaigns. So emails that contain malicious Office documents. And this is an example of one of the documents that was being used to initially load DNS Messenger on endpoints. So they would send a message, and the decoy image in the maldoc was pretty interesting. It has McAfee secure logoing, branding on it. When you think about organizations that leverage, let's say, McAfee for like endpoint protection, users, when they see that logo, probably automatically trust anything else associated with it. So it says, McAfee secured this document, enable content, and enable macros. As we all know, when you do that, that's when the attacker's code starts to execute. In this case, they used an OLE object to launch a VBA, Visual Basic for Applications script that kicked off the infection process and started to install DNS Messenger on the system. So what it would do is, I mentioned it was multi-stage. One of the things that it would do is it would go out and it would pull down a stage 2 payload over DNS. And stage 2 was responsible for establishing persistence if the attacker wanted to. So the attacker had an option in this case. They could choose to be super stealthy and not drop a single conventional file artifact on an infected system. All of this code that's executing is executing within the context of PowerShell, which is executing within the context of the word process on the system. So it's not like it's dropping a bunch of PowerShell scripts onto the file system and executing it. That's all happening in memory. So it would check to see what access rights the user had, and it would make a determination where to store any sort of persistent payload in the registry, so that each time the system rebooted, that registry key would be queried. The PowerShell associated with it would be deobfuscated and kicked off to kick the DNS Messenger off again following a reboot. But once again, that was optional. The attacker could say, no, I want to be super stealthy. I'm just not going to persist across reboots. So stage 3 was acquired following the persistence mechanisms built into stage 2. And stage 3 is that payload that gets stored in the registry that I mentioned, so that each time the system's rebooted, that registry key is read, and it's not pointing to an executable on disk. The PowerShell, the obfuscated PowerShell, is actually within the registry. And stage 3 was responsible for kicking off each time the system was rebooted and going out to retrieve a stage 4 payload that would extend the PowerShell environment and give the attacker more functionality to use to operate within the environment that was being targeted. So let's look at how that payload retrieval process works, because it's super interesting. So what happens is, in stage 3, there's an array list of domains, and the attacker controls the namespaces for all of these domains in this list. You can see most of them look pretty sketchy. But what it would do is it would take one of the domains in that list and it would append a subdomain to it. So in the example on the slide, they picked a domain from that list and they said, okay, well, we're going to make TXT record queries from the infected system to the mail subdomain of that domain. So the resulting query that's made is, give me the TXT record for mail.reld.info. So as normal DNS hierarchy works, those communications get forwarded along the DNS chain until they get to the attacker-controlled server, who will return the results of that TXT record. And the results are the content that you can see there that's encoded PowerShell. That is then sent back to the infected system, deobfuscated, and then executed to kick off that stage 4 functionality. So we're not leveraging HTTP. We're not leveraging HTTPS. This is all being done within DNS. And the DNS protocol supports this. It supports any sort of content that you want to load into a TXT record. And they use this to deliver additional PowerShell commands. So stage 4 was what the attacker would use to operate on the infected system to execute arbitrary commands, possibly use that system as a pivot point for lateral movement. What it would do is it would take the Windows command processor and it would redirect standard in, standard out, and standard error into that PowerShell environment that stage 4 was operating in. It would then select a random domain from a second list present within the stage 4 PowerShell, and it would initiate a multi-stage command and control protocol that the attacker had designed that used nothing but TXT record queries that were being made from infected endpoints and the associated responses from the attacker server. So the first phase of this command and control protocol, the attacker called it a SYN query. The infected system would make a DNS TXT query for a domain that the attacker controlled, and based on the response that it received, it would determine whether or not to continue to execute. And then if it was told, yeah, keep going, it would basically make a message query. And you can see an example of this. This is where the data exchange actually takes place. You can see that they're making a DNS request for a really, really long subdomain that the attacker controls. And it's an alphanumeric string that's actually hex. So when you actually decode that subdomain that it's making the request for, you can see that it actually decodes to the output of the Windows command line processor. So they're basically sending a shell to the attacker server using DNS-TXT queries, and then the associated responses would be the commands that the attacker wanted to run. So pretty interesting way that they implemented a bidirectional shell functionality using nothing but DNS. So this is just a kind of a flow that shows how that C2 mechanism works and all the different phases that take place. This is all being done over DNS. So don't get SYN mixed up with TCP SYN packets. This is just what they called that stage of the DNS communications in that C2 protocol. And they actually had full-on custom packet structures to support how they were able to interact with the command line processor on the infected system in a protected environment, because they were able to leverage that hierarchy and the automatic forwarding of DNS queries that takes place anytime you try to resolve a domain. So fast forward a few months, and we were monitoring, and we detected that the threat actor associated with DNS Messenger had actually started launching additional campaigns that were leveraging an updated version of DNS Messenger. So in this particular case, the emails were pretty targeted. They were targeted. They weren't spray and pray like what you see from spam botnets. They were targeting specific individuals, and they were making the emails spoofed to appear as if they were from the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they made it appear as if the email was associated with the Edgar system. If you're not familiar with it, it's a system that the SEC supports that allows organizations to make the different filings that they need to the SEC. So imagine if your job is to interact with the SEC, you might see this email, it looks legitimate, and open the attached Word document. So this is an example of one of the documents associated with these campaigns. Fairly well done. They used the branding from SEC to make it look legitimate. They actually had OMB approval numbers, and they added all the little touches to try to add legitimacy to this email. And in this case, they weren't using macros, they were using dynamic data exchange, or DDE, which is functionality present within Word that allows you to link content between multiple places within a Word document and dynamically import it into the document at runtime when you open it up. So you can see you get a little prompt that says, this refers to external files, do you want to load them now? So if the user selects yes in this case, what happens is the Windows command line processor is used to call PowerShell. They echo out sec.gov to make it look legitimate to the user. They see a little message that says sec.gov. And then they go out and they download content from a compromised Louisiana state government web server. And then the contents of that TXT document are then fed back into PowerShell and executed to kick off the next stage of the infection process. And you can see in this particular case, inside of the retrieved content, they actually had an additional stage of PowerShell that was base64 encoded, which I truncated because it was super long, and it would have made the slide look really nasty. So stage 2 is then deobfuscated and kicked off to continue the infection process. And one of the things that they would do is they would store that stage 2, once again, similar to last time, in the registry. And that's how they would persist across reboots. And the next thing they would do is they would check to see if a specific mutex was present on the system. So if you're not familiar with mutexes, they're typically used to avoid having the same program run on a system multiple times at the same time. So the program kicks off the first time, and it creates a mutex. And then if you don't want your program to run multiple times simultaneously on a system, you just check for that mutex, and if it exists, you terminate execution. So it's a way to manage that. And they were using it to make sure that DNS Messenger wasn't running multiple times on the same infected system. So the next thing they would do is they would persist. And they would establish that persistence, and they had a ton of different ways that they could choose to persist on systems, depending on how they wanted to store the payload and then call it when they rebooted the system. So they had a bunch of if-then statements in the PowerShell that's basically resulted in storage of the payload in a bunch of different potential places in registry. They could also create a scheduled task. And one of the interesting things about the scheduled task that they would create is they put a random delay counter associated with it. So each time the system reboots, it will randomly sleep for a while before it kicks off the actual malware again. So if you're analyzing it, it looks different every time the system reboots. They could also use alternate data streams to persist, and they could also make WMI subscriptions, Windows Management Instrumentation database subscriptions, and they could use that to persist as well. So there's a lot of really interesting persistence characteristics and techniques that this malware used. So stage 3 was where it gets really interesting. This is where it would start to communicate out with the attacker's command and control server. So what it would do is it would obtain the system serial number, and then it would make an MD5 hash of the serial number itself on the system. Then it would use the first 10 bytes to generate a DNS host name. So the result of the operation is similar to what you see there below. So what it would do is it would take that host name and it would append the string stage to it. And then it would append another counter that started at 0 that would tick every time it communicated out to command and control. And then it would select a domain from a list of attacker-controlled domains, and that would be the root domain that it would make a DNS request for. So this is what that operation kind of looks like. So they'd first make an A record request for that particular resource that they generated, that was generated by the malware, to the attacker-controlled name server. And they would get a response in the form of what looks like an IP address. Then they would make a TXT record request for the same host name. And they would take the contents of that request and they would perform a mathematical calculation and compare it to the contents of the A record for data verification. So you can kind of see here, here's an A record and the associated response, and then it generates that integer value based on the IP that it was responded from the attacker-controlled server, and then it would do the same thing for the TXT record, take a portion of the response and compare it to make sure that the resulting integer values match, kind of like a checksum, to make sure that it should continue running. So this is how it obtained stage 4. So it would generate that integer value using the first portion of that response, and if it matched, that meant the data was good, and it would create a variable and assign that data to a variable, and then it would do the same thing again and again and again, each time performing that verification. And it would do that until the verification either failed or the returned IP address was 0.0.0. And it would take all of the data it had retrieved, and it would just have a huge blob of encoded PowerShell. And so when it got the, hey, I'm done sending you payload information from the server, it would deobfuscate the contents of that PowerShell and then kick it off to kick off stage 4. And stage 4 was basically a rat. It was a remote access Trojan. So it did pretty much all the things you can typically expect a remote access Trojan to do on a system. It used DNS for command retrieval, so it would retrieve commands to execute on the system from the attacker-controlled DNS server. It would post sensitive data that it was exfiltrating using HTTP, which was a little bit different this time. They weren't trying to exfiltrate over DNS this time. They were using HTTP for that, but for command retrieval, they would use DNS. And it can be used to execute pretty much any command that you have access to run on a Windows system. So if you get a patient 0 in an environment, they have as much control as the victim did on that system, and they can use that as the place that they can start to pivot from, move laterally, start to work towards some of the longer term mission objectives they had.
Okay, so now we're going to switch forward a little bit. Those attacks happened in 2017, as you saw. We'll now come up to fall of 2018. One of the things we always see with the attackers is they're always watching what their peers are doing and improving on that. So what we noticed is another attack. We called it DNS espionage. And what we noticed is this same threat actor did 2 different attacks. One of them was a rat, sort of like we just saw with DNS Messenger, and another one is actually starting to target the DNS infrastructure. So we're going to first look at that first event where they were trying to get a rat on the system. So again, easiest way to get a rat on the system is target the user. User's that weak link. In this case, they would either send a spear phishing email, or what they actually did here, which was really interesting, is they would target social media sites where people may be looking for jobs. And they would actually put documents up there, but they were pretending to be legitimate sites. Like Wipro.com, Suncor.com are legitimate places where you can go look for a job, but people don't know about DNS, so they would do HR-Wipro. It looks close. Most users think that's a valid site, has nothing to do with Wipro, so they would go there, download a document, and they'd get a Word doc. And as usual, it has macros in it because, That's attackers love to use to get to run code. Well, in this case, they actually had 2 macros in the document. So when you opened up the document, one macro would execute. It basically just made a copy of the data onto the system as a doc file. Didn't really look suspicious. But then it wasn't until the second macro, when you actually closed the document, another macro would run, and that's where it started doing its malicious activity. You may think about that. Why'd they put 2 macros in there? Well, one of the things the attackers always know is that as defenders, we're putting roadblocks on the network. They know a lot of people are deploying sandboxes to check files that are coming in as attachments, but they also realize that not all sandboxes are created equal. If they're not that intelligent, they're going to open up the document and see if it does anything unusual. Well, in this case, if it's not smart enough to open it and then also close it, it's never going to see the malicious activity, and it's going to look benign, and it's going to get down and execute on the system, and they're going to get their rat installed. So, with most rats, if I want it to run and I want to execute commands, I have to be able to communicate back to my infrastructure. Well, in this case, they had 2 ways they could do that. They could do it with HTTP, common one we've seen in rats over the years, nothing special there. But these attackers also had a mode, which they had in DNS, where if they had maybe a more sensitive target, one that was probably monitoring HTTP, they could actually do their command and control similar to DNS Messenger, but over DNS this time. And unlike DNS Messenger, these guys use regular A records. So they just look like regular DNS requests, but they were able to do commands, exfiltrate data back and forth. So let's look at how that worked. So again, they have to start off with a domain. Well, in this case, they just created one that looked like Office 360. If you notice, they replaced the O with a 0 and the 0 with a little o, just enough to make it look legitimate to a user. And again, they needed to send their command, so the gray part, they would encode the ID of the system. And whenever this malware took over a system, it would basically assign a 2-digit code. In this case, it was GT. So they have to send that. That's what they base 32 encoded in the gray part. But they also knew they were going to have to send this request multiple times. Well, they didn't want it to look suspicious, so they wanted it to be different. So they added the blue part, which is just random data. That way, they can execute these requests multiple times, and it's always going to look like I'm going to a different subdomain. In this case, you can see when they first did the request, they get a reply back of 0.1.0.3. Not really a valid IP address. DNS doesn't care. But what it's telling the malware is that I'm going to send you one command, and it's going to be 3 characters long. So they re-execute their DNS request. The gray portion stays the same because I'm still the same system. Different blue value because they generate the random value again. But if you'll notice, now we have a different IP address. This time we get 100.105.114.0. Well, if you look at the ASCII chart, that 100 corresponds to D, 105 to R, 114 to R. So they basically encoded the command they wanted to run in that IP address. And in this case, it was a short one. They could do it in one IP. But if they had longer ones, they would just do multiple requests until they had the whole command. And then obviously, when they've executed the command, they need to get the data back out. So they would actually then start executing a bunch of DNS requests, exfiltrating all the data. And they kept it small so that the domains didn't get large. So they would just chunk it out a little bit at a time. And if you notice, they still use the system ID, but on the replies, they would put a 2 in front of it. Whereas they had a 0 when they were first doing the request. Now they're sending the results, so they're going to give it a 2 every time. So again, in regular DNS messages now, regular A record requests, they're actually receiving commands, executing them, and getting the results sent back to the attackers all through DNS traffic. So if you're looking on the network, you're not going to see anything if you're not actually taking those DNS requests apart to see that all these DNS requests are going to that domain that they had there. We could actually look at it when we have Umbrella. We can look at our Investigate toolkit. We could actually see lots of things happening with DNS. And what we really noticed with this one is even though they had that capability, they did use it for their more high-value targets. They didn't just use it all the time because they realized that if they used it extensively, it was going to more likely be detected, taken apart, analyzed. So they wanted to make sure that this was a tool they could still reliably go to and stay under the radar. So now we're going to shift forward a little bit, because so far we've looked at ways that they can certainly tunnel data through DNS. But another way that you can abuse DNS is I have to trust the data coming back from DNS to be the right server. So if you think about it, look at the way DNS works. I go issue my request. It goes through this DNS hierarchy. I get an IP, and I go to that IP to do whatever I want to do. I display the page, get all the data. Well, what they want to do here is what happens if I manipulate that DNS hierarchy in some fashion. Maybe I target your registrar account. I target your registrar in their company themselves. If I can alter the value of what's coming back, instead of going to the server you want, you go to my attacker-controlled server, and then I can redirect you to the real server. So now I become a man-in-the-middle type situation. And that's what we started seeing with this second part of DNS espionage. And, if you want to look at it, DNS hierarchy is pretty complicated. There's lots of different steps, but there's many places you can target. A simple one is the registrar account. Whenever you have a domain name, you pay some registrar to take care of that. And you have an account. You can go in and change what IP address is on there. Well, if that account has a weak old password on it, I can probably brute force it, break in, and change that data and manipulate it. Or I might even go higher up. I can go all the way up to the registry, maybe target the registry for an entire company. If I can break into that network, I can now manipulate the DNS and then the IP addresses for any of those entries that are in that database. And that's what we started seeing here. So let's look at the second one DNS espionage was doing. They went in, they set up some accounts. Basically, they went and set up servers in the cloud, basically, with IP addresses associated with them. And then they basically started attacking different registrars, trying to get those accounts so they could actually then redirect the traffic. And in the same situation, they would also do create a self-signed cert with Let's Encrypt. Not the best to fool a real security person, but most regular users are going to see it still looks encrypted. I'm going to believe it's a true cert. I'll go to the site that's out there. And we started noticing that's what they were doing. They would set these up for a domain, set up that fake certificate on it, and then we could look in at passive DNS and actually see that people were trying to go to this company's address. They were getting redirected to the attacker's controlled site, with the intention being that it looks like you're going to the real site. You enter your username and credentials, then they redirect you to the real site and let you log in officially, but now they've captured your credentials. So at that point, I can now target your network, but it's much more stealthy because I'm using valid credentials. I'm not breaking in any obvious way. I'm just logging in as a regular user. And we saw that happen multiple times. We actually went back and looked. This happened over a much longer time period. It happened over a couple years. These attacks were happening. By going in and looking at passive DNS, we could see that these redirections were actually happening. It was actually so scary that, I don't know how many people remember, but I think it was in the beginning of 2019, Department of Homeland Security actually came out with a statement to all the government organizations and said, hey, you need to tighten down your registrar accounts. You need to enable two-factor if it's possible. Make sure you have strong passwords, because they were afraid that a lot of other government entities were going to be targeted in the same fashion to basically have people redirected and stealing the credentials so they could break into those networks. So again, it became up on the radar. But with these guys, they were still only targeting that registrar account that I have for my own domain, assuming I didn't set it up correctly. Well, shift forward to the beginning of 2019. We have another attacker group we labeled Sea Turtle come on the stage. They went higher. They decided, why go for just that registering account? That's like going each time I have to break an account to get to one domain. What if I go a little higher in the food chain? Then I can break into a network and do it for a lot of different domains all at once. So in this case, their motive was clearly espionage. I mean, these guys were trying to break into very sensitive networks. They were going for high-value targets. Think government, intelligence organizations, oil, natural gas, a lot of things in the Middle East. Pretty much it's obviously state-sponsored. These guys were targeting things for a reason. And in fact, this is one of the first things that we can find where they actually publicly took control of an actual registry. In this case, it was like a government level domain. So think like a top level government registry. All the domains for that country were now under control of these attackers. So they could manipulate any of those domains and redirect people wherever they wanted. And obviously to do this, they can't just target the companies themselves. Because if you think about it, I'm targeting the DNS infrastructure. So there's actually collateral damage. You think I have to go where those registries are. Who owns those registries? It's not the companies. It's whoever's providing that service. So there's collateral damage. In this case, they had to hit some of those registry providers in the US, some in Sweden, to basically then facilitate them getting to the actual domains that they were trying to use to get into those actual networks. So to give you a little bit of a map of this, you can see a couple of secondary targets. Those are just the ones that either housed the registry or they were registrar providers. But you can see in orange the real guys that were being targeted. It was highly targeted into the Middle East. And they were going for very high value targets, government, military. That's why we couldn't even put the domain names up there. It was pretty sensitive because even when we were talking about it, they were still active. They were actually redirecting people as we were doing it. So let's walk through that, how this actually happened. If you think about it, I'm targeting, say, a registry. So I go and try and find a way to gain access to that registry's network. They're like any other company. They have visible presence on the internet. They have potential vulnerabilities. They have users I can take advantage of. I find a way to break in. Once I break in, I start moving laterally, trying to get more control of that network. Then I may exfiltrate some data out that gives me information about how the network's set up. My whole goal is to basically gain enough control of that network so I can start modifying the registry. Because they're the ones who are actually doing the normal modifications. They control where anybody goes when they're trying to retrieve one of those domains. So if I can control that, I can actually use the real tools that would update it to update it for me. And that's what the attacker started doing. They would issue an update command to say, hey, instead of going to the name server controlled by this registry, go to my name server. And at that point, everything was off because now any requests were going to the attacker-controlled server and they could point them wherever they wanted. So then the victim gets this DNS reply. It's now pretty much going to a forged address, one the attackers set up. So obviously, they're going to go there. They're going to make it look legitimate like it's the real site. Once it happens, they're going to grab their credentials. They're going to harvest it. Then they'll redirect the user to the real site. So from a user's perspective, they were given a domain. IP comes in. They get to a site that looks legitimate. They give their credentials, and then they're on the real site because they will happily redirect you and log you in. They don't see any different. They're actually where they tried to get to, but they've also then leaked their credentials. At that point, then they can log into the network and try and do further attacks. And we actually saw them doing that. They were trying and get more control on the system. And one of the interesting things with these attackers, I mean, we've been doing this for years. Edmund's doing it for at least 3 with Talos, and I've been doing at least 5 or 6, is that most of the time when we publish about an attack, the attackers will basically back off. They're like, oh, wait, someone's noticing what we're doing. We need to cool back a little while. We'll just take it easy and not keep going. With these guys, they didn't seem to care. We published about what they were doing, and they just continued to blaze on what they were doing. They kept escalating their activities. They weren't stopping. They didn't really care that anybody knew about it, so it was like they didn't really care about any kind of retribution. They were going to continue to do what they were trying to do. And they would basically, they took the certificate thing to a new level. I mean, they would go through, and on some of the previous ones, they would just do a self-signed cert. These guys would actually go to other certificate providers and then create a cert for a domain, a real cert, and the other provider didn't really check that much on their credentials, so they would actually get a real cert, and then it looked very legitimate. And then they would even go onto the network itself and try and steal certs on there as well. They were pretty effective at targeting we hear about tunneling, we heard that in the beginning. They would go for the VPN endpoints for these networks as well and be able to impersonate that VPN endpoint. So now people are in that trusted, safe environment. I'm logging into my VPN, but it was actually the attacker's controlled setup, and then they would redirect them over to the network. So, I mean, the whole point we did this talk for you is just to let you know that DNS is now becoming one of those weak spots. It's needed for all of our networks to work, but the attackers are more using it to their advantage. So you really need to think about, monitoring DNS on your network. I've done lots of talks at places, and I'll ask people how many people monitor DNS, and hardly anybody raises their hand. They think like Edmund, well, I have my own DNS resolver, I don't need to worry about it. Well, these attacks all go through that infrastructure. If you have a registrar account, make sure you enable two-factor. It's important to make that as hard as possible to break into it. Try and lock down those services for your domains that are out there to make it harder for them to change that data. Patch your systems. I mean, a lot of times these guys are targeting, like everything else, when you haven't patched a network, they're going to target that weak spot. But the key is just to really start thinking about the protocols on the network like DNS and start monitoring them. Make sure you know what's happening, because the attackers know that that's a way they can, again, get into your network. So at that, I don't know if you have anything to add, or otherwise, we'll close it out. I don't know how much time we have here. I'm happy to answer any questions we have at the end, and I'll stay at the end too. Yes? Well, I mean, the two, basically, if you think about it, they're just the registrars and the registries, they're just providing a database that lets you get a value back for a domain. So what you're doing is, most of the time, it's not really modifying what's going to them, because that's what I supply. I'm just giving it a domain name. The problem is I'm being redirected to different name servers instead of the real name server. And I don't really see that from a DNS perspective, because all I know is I sent it, it went to the authoritative name server, and I got a reply back. So it's basically what the changes that a lot of the new ones, they're doing it through the actual change mechanism. Whereas if I hack into your account and do it, there may be some telltale signs that I manipulated your IP entry. When we start talking about them updating it with the real tools, it's going to make it look legitimate everywhere, because that's how the system is updated. Yes? Well, I mean, part of the thing with that is that, obviously if you go and update it, you'll put it back to the real value now. But a lot of the things, the damage is already done here. The thing is, if you're monitoring it, that's the thing. A lot of people have set these and they haven't changed them in years. And some of the more, like with Sea Turtle, some of the attacks we saw, these guys didn't want to be detected. They would change it in the span of maybe 10 or 20 minutes and then change it back. So they weren't even leaving it changed. They were like putting in certain windows because they knew that the resource they wanted was going to log in. They're redirecting them and then they're putting it back again, making it even harder to detect. Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's different ones. On some of these where they had the self-signed search, you would have telltale signs that it's not the legitimate search, so you'd probably get some warnings. On some of the ones that Sea Turtle did, you probably wouldn't notice anything because they were actually using legitimate certificates, albeit from a different provider of certificates, but it was still legitimate for that domain. So everything doing the checking would say, this certificate is valid for that domain, it's legitimate. And at that point, you're not really going to notice any difference. And that's the scary part on it. They were able to steal these credentials without the user even noticing because they had done so much to make it look legitimate. Yes?
What's the best way to monitor to know that some type of targeted attack is actually happening?
You want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, so in some of the more sophisticated attacks, where the user's actively being redirected to malicious infrastructure, what they were doing was they were taking the zone for the domain that they were targeting, and they were updating the NS record or the name server records for that zone. So say the DNS, the authoritative DNS server for this zone or this domain and anything under it, or is this IP address that I control. So if you're doing namespace monitoring, most of the time your NS records don't change that frequently. You might modify like A records, but it's not like it's super dynamic in most environments. So if you're monitoring for, what are the responses associated with NS records for my domain, my company's domain, you should be able to detect anytime those change, because obviously as soon as they get changed, the IP address that gets returned when you make an NS record lookup is going to be different. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what we should do in our environment to try to mitigate some of this. We don't look at DNS at all. We have a Windows DNS set up, pointing to our ISP DNS server.
Yeah, and the beauty of a lot of these. Yeah, and I guess one of the beauties of these types of attacks is it's not like they're compromising your infrastructure directly to facilitate this, right? They're compromising a third party that the internet in general uses to provide that service for DNS resolution. So with some of the earlier tunneling-based attacks, you can monitor for that with conventional security controls in your org. But for some of the more sophisticated ones where they're targeting like core internet infrastructure, those are much, much more difficult for you as an organization to defend against. You can put two-factor on your account. You can put zone freezes so that a lot of the registrars will require a second form of authorization, maybe a phone call or something like that, before they'll let any changes be made. So that's something they're called, I think they're called locks. Registrar locks is the terminology that they use. Not everyone provides that though, so you'd have to ask your registrar, if they support that sort of two-factor. But that'll mitigate a lot of them. And then, obviously it's, making sure that you're monitoring so that even if you can't prevent it, you can at least detect and respond to it when it does occur.
Last question, then we'll get the rest of them afterwards because we're getting to the end.
There have been a lot of articles popping up over the past few months about DNS over HTTPS. Is that an attempt to mitigate any of that? Would it ever mitigate any of that? What's going on?
Well, so the one thing that you're gonna see, and we've already seen malware that makes use of DOH because nobody really has mechanisms to inspect that because it's encrypted. But really, it's going to force organizations to lose that layer of visibility if they allow that in their environment. Most of the browsers in the protocol, the RFC itself, they support you being able to override that with enterprise-wide settings to disable it if you want to make sure you can still inspect the contents of name resolution. But it definitely creates a potential area of exposure that malware authors are going to target, because anytime new encrypted protocols come out, that's where they go.
And the other part of that is, like, if you look at the ones where they're targeting the infrastructure, DOH only moves that to another point before it jumps off to the infrastructure. So it's still going to be exposed to it. It just, you lose the visibility from the local level, so it can make it even more challenging for the defender. So with that, hopefully it was helpful. We'll stay around and answer questions afterwards, but we have to wrap it up so it can be done. Thank you much.